Okay, quick question. What's the deadliest maritime disaster in history? If you said the Titanic, and honestly, most people do, I get it. But what if I told you there was one that killed 6 times the number of people that died on the Titanic in one night, all under an hour, and you've probably never heard of it? Let's go back in time to January 1945. The world it happened in? The war is almost over. Everyone can feel it. The Allied forces are closing in on Germany from the west. And from the east, the Soviet Red Army is coming. And they are furious. Now, to understand what that means, you have to remember what the German army had done when it marched into Soviet territory a few years earlier. Villages burned, millions of civilians killed. One of the most brutal occupations in modern history. The Soviet soldiers advancing west in January 1945 saw what was done to their homeland. They had lost brothers, fathers, entire towns they grew up in. They were not coming to shake hands. The German civilians living in the Eastern Territories knew exactly what was coming. Word travelled fast. Stories of what Soviet troops were doing to German civilians in the towns they overtook were spreading by the hour. And so 2 million people started running, and literally running on foot, in carts, in the middle of a Baltic winter, through temperatures that could freeze you to death overnight. Mothers carrying children. Elderly people who could barely walk were struggling. Wounded soldiers on stretchers. All of them were pouring toward the coast looking for ships. The German Navy arranged a massive evacuation called Operation Hannibal, they called it, with over 800 vessels. It was one of the largest naval evacuations in history, and sitting in the harbour at Gotenhafen, a port city which is now in modern-day Poland, was one of the biggest ships available. The Wilhelm Gustloff. This ship has a strange history, and you kind of need to know it. The Gustloff wasn't built for war. It was built in 1937 as a luxury cruise liner, part of a Nazi program called Strength Through Joy, which was basically the regime's attempt to make ordinary German workers feel like they were getting a good life. Cheap holidays, cruises in the Baltic, Nazi propaganda dressed up as a vacation package. Adolf Hitler personally attended its launch. When the war started, it was converted into a hospital ship, then eventually just a floating barrack sitting in the harbour at Gotenhafen for 4 years, barely moving. At one time it was used for housing naval trainees. By 1940 its engines had stopped running properly. And now, in January 1945, they were firing them back up and loading as many people as possible onto it. Official records said about 6,100 people were aboard, but those records are almost certainly fiction. The docks were so overwhelmed, the crowds so chaotic, that the people counting passengers literally ran out of paper and just stopped counting. Historians and survivors pieced together later that the real number was probably closer to 10,500, on a ship designed to comfortably hold 1,900. Every corridor is jammed. Every cabin was packed. The air below deck was so hot and thick it was hard to breathe. Above deck, it was freezing. The ship was supposed to sail in together with 2 torpedo boats as escort and another passenger liner alongside it. But before departure, the second passenger liner developed engine trouble and turned back. One of the torpedo boats did the same. The Gustloff left with a single escort. And that was the first decision that would kill thousands of people. The man below the water, about 30 miles off the Polish coast, was a Soviet submarine called the S-13. Its commander, Captain Alexander Marinesko, had been at sea for nearly 3 weeks. On the evening of January 30th, he spotted something through his periscope. A massive ship, running lights glowing against the blackness of the Baltic, moving at only 12 knots, completely exposed. Marinesko couldn't know exactly who was on board. He assumed it was a military transport. He later said he was certain it was full of soldiers who had trampled on Mother Russia and were now fleeing to safety. He made his decision immediately. He manoeuvred the S-13 to the shore side of the Gustloff, the direction the watch crew would least expect an attack from, since they'd be scanning out to sea. He got to within 1,000 metres. The crew had loaded 4 torpedoes. At 9:16 in the evening, Marinesco gave the order. He fired. 58 minutes. 3 torpedoes hit. The first struck the bow right where the crew quarters were. The people best trained to manage an emergency on board a ship were killed almost instantly. The second hit the section of the hull where the Women's Naval Auxiliary had been sleeping in that converted pool. Most of them didn't survive the impact. The third hit the engine room. Every light on the ship went out. The lifeboats and life rafts, already inadequate for the number of people on board, were in many cases frozen to the deck. The crew who would have known how to free them were dead. On deck it became a stampede immediately. People were trampling each other and throwing themselves overboard into water that was -2 degrees Celsius. The Gustloff sank bow first. In 58 minutes, 9 rescue vessels eventually arrived. They pulled an estimated number of 1,200 people from the water. That's it, out of somewhere between 9 and 10,000. The silence, now here's where this gets really dark. The Gustloff sank on January 30th, 1945. 9,000 people died, and within days it was as if it had barely happened. Why? The Nazis suppressed it first. They released nothing publicly. In the final weeks of a losing war, news that a ship crammed with thousands of German civilians, including approximately 5. No 0 children had just been torpedoed to the bottom of the Baltic, would have been catastrophic for morale. So the German press said nothing. The victims were German. And in a world now recovering from the Holocaust and the full horror of what the Nazi regime had done, there was almost no political or cultural space to talk about German suffering. The Soviet Union had its own reasons to stay quiet. Captain Marinesco, the man who fired the torpedoes that killed 9,000 people, most of them civilians and children, was eventually celebrated as a Soviet war hero. Monuments to him. Streets are named after him. That celebration sits a lot more comfortably when the full details of what his torpedoes hit aren't widely known. What it means? The Titanic has a museum, a blockbuster film, and a dedicated wing in maritime history that every schoolchild on Earth has encountered in some form. Wilhelm Gustloff has almost nothing. And the difference isn't about scale. It's about whose suffering we decided was worth preserving. And that's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Because the question doesn't stop at 1945. Every generation decides which tragedies count, which victims deserve memorials, which stories get told and which ones get quietly set aside because they're politically inconvenient, or complicated, or don't fit cleanly into the narrative we've already agreed on. The 9,000 people who went into the Baltic on the night of January 30th, 1945, most of them ordinary people who didn't start the war, people who were just running from it. They deserved better than silence. If this is the kind of history you think more people should know about, share and subscribe for more.